people, welcome back to Screenworthy, brought to you as always by The Mind Refinery. I'm your host, Kyle Bodanis. On this episode, we're looking at HBO's The Watchmen and why it's been able to cut through the last year of television and emerge as a truly original work, bagging 26 Emmy nominations. Also, if you like what you hear, rate and subscribe us wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to follow us on social media. And now, here's the show. Alright guys, here to discuss The Watchmen. Recent 26 nomination HBO's Watchmen are Mind Refinery creatives Boyan Nedick and Omar Morrison.
Yep.
Hey, how's it going?
So, since the last time we recorded this podcast, the Emmys dropped their nominations, and Watchmen was one of the notable stories there, with 26 nominations across all categories, including Best Limited Series and actor nods for Regina King and Jeremy Irons. I kind of want to look at this from an impact standpoint, and why it was able to hit with fans and critics, but also, in terms of awards recognition, especially given that award shows like the Emmys have a tendency to make stupid decisions and just have the same perennial nominees. So I want to look at what made this so special. So going into this, after the movie, what was the expectation when you heard this project dropped? Like, what was your thoughts on this world at the time?
Well, I mean, I was really skeptical. It just sounds like another, cash in. I'm skeptical and I'm cynical, I guess. So I just thought it was just another cash in of an existing property. And, I kind of, even though Alan Moore is a crazy wizard from a different dimension, I do sometimes sympathize with him as well when he, offhand just dismisses any adaptations of his works, because most of the time they're not great adaptations, and his works in comics makes him one of the geniuses of comic. Like he's a genius of that medium, and knowing how to use that medium. So and a lot of his genius in there does not translate well to film. So they're almost unadaptable in some sense. So I was skeptical. I didn't think it was gonna be anything good, even though it was HBO, and sort of HBO has rarely let me down. And I don't think I didn't even watch it when it came out. I watched it, I believe, I think it was like June or something. So maybe like 2 months ago, and yeah, I mean, I was wrong. I was wrong. And the worst part is, when I didn't I didn't watch it, and for a long time I'm listening to what other people are saying about it. And even when they're talking about it, it just sounds like, what the hell have they done with this property? Like when I heard about it's not even in the same, it's not even the same like group of people, same group of heroes. It's a spin-off, it's in that world. And I just thought the worst about it. And I was so happy to, when I finally sat down and watched it, to discover how incredible it is.
Yeah, I was kind of in the same boat. I didn't really, I didn't really gravitate towards it. I mean, as you guys know, I'm a huge comic book guy. I really enjoyed the original movie that came out in 2009. When it came out, I just thought maybe that HBO was just trying to capitalize on the whole superhero genre thing. So I just felt they were just picking it because they knew it was gritty and it's something they could ride that wave with. So I didn't really even dive into it, to be honest. Like, this was actually my first watch of it, and yeah, like Boyan said, I was completely wrong. Like, I was blown away by what I saw.
I mean, I was pretty cynical, to be honest, myself, given the climate of, reboots and this grasping at straws for content. I didn't really see how this effectively fit into what HBO was doing. And, clearly I got this wrong as well. Like, I was very much, anti this. I'm like, why are we doing this? Why is this why are they going for the cash grab? Because, that's not really how their business model works. So I'm trying to figure out as to why, was figuring out where, it came in. And, I was also wondering how the previous characters were going to fit in this ideas that was, conveyed by the the movie, and I was more wondering if it was gonna gravitate towards the movie and just assume that that was the case. But it really follows the line of the comic books, because it has the squid attack, and it shows people having PTSD from that. And I like how they incorporated Silk Spectre in it, and I liked. I really liked how they took it and made it fresh and made it relevant, revisiting the Tulsa riots. Um, I enjoyed the Zack Snyder flick. I thought it was. I didn't think it was great. I mean, I love the comic book better, and it's funny you mentioned the Alan Moore thing, because I feel like he probably got mad because of there was drastic changes made, especially to the ending. Whereas would be very curious as to how he feels about this, because it kind of lived up a little bit more to the story he created, and also had these concepts of power and the limitation of power and the limitation of hero power, that really kind of drives the original story. But then you're throwing in this idea of racism and applying it to a very modern context, given what's been going on. I mean, like, Boyan, what did you think of the movie?
I mean, I'm in the same boat as you guys. I mean, I think one of its weaknesses to me that kind of, a lot of people will give it praise for generally how authentic it was, the story of the comic, with the exception of the ending, and for a long time, and I still do believe that the ending made more sense. Um, I guess up until the series, I thought that the ending made more sense in the movie than it did in the comic. I thought the comic's ending was a little silly, and the series actually like kind of gave it a different perspective of the whole the whole squid thing, and what's behind it, that actually made me gravitate more towards that making more sense. But and otherwise, I thought the movie was its weakness was that it tried to do a frame by frame recreation of the comic. Like it just it like I said, there's every medium has its unique strengths that are almost impossible to translate to another medium, and Zack Snyder tried to do that. He tried to translate a comic book into a movie, into a one by one translation, and not make it strong as a movie in the medium of film. Um, so I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the world, and it was funny. It was funny to me too that when I watched the Watchmen, I was first time the movie in the theater. I thought at that point that I was exhausted from superhero films. So when I walked out, I was like, "Oh, this is refreshing." It's a what if take if superheroes were actually real in the sort of grimy, gritty world that we live in, the cynical world that we live in, and not this magical world that Marvel likes to present, where no real questions about the real problems that people face are ever faced, like racism or the politics of power and whatnot. So it was refreshing to me to see that, and to my, I guess, embarrassment, I hadn't read the comic before I saw the movie, so I ended up buying the comic after. So yeah, and I mean that's what I mean. I thought that was a really good thing that what it did, and how it represented heroes, and I enjoyed the movie, but there's still a lot of things that I'm having difficulty with.
Yeah, like I enjoyed the movie. I thought it was an interesting take. I loved that it was darker, and I liked how Zack Snyder tried to create. He's great at creating worlds, and I like that he tried to create this world and take it out of the comic books and bring it to life. Um, like Boyan said, not diving into the whole Marvel formula and how their characters really don't have the same level of depth and real world problems that we face every day. I felt like a lot of these characters could be relatable in many ways. Um, and to be honest, it really took me at the time. Like when I didn't read the comic at all, so when I went into watching it, I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna watch this. I have no idea what this is about. I heard of it, and I was just enamored by just how everything looked. Um, Going into the series now, watching it in this climate, I think was a crazier experience for me. I don't know how you guys felt, but watching this in 2020 with everything that's going on, with Black Lives Matter, the riots and stuff like that, and then seeing um, a comic book take on racism and how it's implemented and how it was sent, how the whole I don't want to say storyline, but essentially the world was centered around that. Kind of took me by surprise and actually changed the tone of all of it for me, and it kind of made it a lot more realer, and I was able to sympathize with characters on both sides, if that makes sense. So yeah, like it just this show kind of just blew my mind with that, and I don't know if I'm being biased because of the climate that we're in today. Maybe if I watched it last year, I might have a different opinion on it, but as of now, I think it's one of the best shows I've seen so far, just based off of the climate that we're in.
I I mean, there's a whole thematic shift from the comic book and the
Mm-hmm.
movies. The movies focus on the idea of power. This continues that, as I said, but like it looks and how it manifested in a world, which is just more of a hyper real version of ours. Like, do you think this thematic approach made it more obviously like more relevant to the current thematic? The current political climate, and like, do you think that a traditional reboot would have been successful? Because, like, for example, if it just followed along the lines of the kind of the Zack Snyder thing. Because I will say this, I do agree with your point, and like it made me really appreciate the comic book more, and like the way that ended. Because I had read it just before I saw the movie. But I had anticipated that they were going to go along the lines of of the film, but I like that they moored this to something to something else. So do you think a traditional reboot would have been as successful?
Um, I think for me, probably not. If they had done it maybe earlier, it might have been as successful. I just think that, and this is my personal opinion, I'm not sure if everyone has the same sentiment, but I think a lot of people are kind of getting tired of the whole superhero thing and are kind of happy to get a break from it. So it coming out kind of like in the height of like Endgame and all these other movies, The Joker and stuff like that coming out, I think it still would have done well, but I don't think it would have had the same impact if it was just a traditional reboot.
I agree. I can't disagree with that. I mean, I don't think, first of all, I don't think HBO would have picked up the show at all,
Mm-hmm.
or been interested at all if it was just a traditional reboot of the original. I think they're I guess maybe honestly I might be just an HBO fanboy here, but like I think they have a very good record and experience and skill with picking shows that do something different, that explore you know ground that hasn't been treaded on before. They don't follow the pack, which is like, you mentioned you were surprised. It was kind of surprising at first that HBO is even going in this direction. It made it look like they were following the pack in terms of all the other superhero content out there, and they kind of are. But when you actually look at the show, it's completely different than anything else, even close to it. So like I said, I don't think they would have picked it up. And if another network or like Netflix or a TV network did pick it up, it would have just been another, gritty take on superheroes lost in a sea of like Umbrella Academies and Titans and The Boys and whatever Marvel crap is, or and what's it called? What's the CW crap is being put out there? You know what I mean? It's just there's just so much stuff out there in that genre, general sort of very generalized genre that on those other networks it would have been lost. Whereas whereas what they had actually did with the show and how I mean, they perfectly used the themes that already existed and the cynicism, the natural cynicism and that existed in the world of that story, and especially when it goes back into the history of the Vietnam War and all that alternate history, and they tied it to real issues that are still being faced today, that can also be tied that issues that never really ended from the 50s and 60s and from before that. And I think it found just this perfect comfortable spot in that world and tied it to our world, which makes it feel so much more immersive than anything else. It's almost an insult to call it a superhero series, because
Yeah,
it's,
this is for
yeah,
sure.
there's elements of it, but like what it's actually saying and how it's handling these issues, these topics and themes is so much more mature and deep and introspective than any of the shallow crap that's being, or like, or that's being thrown at us, or when studios just kind of pay lip service to these stories of civil rights and racism and whatnot. It's, there's a lot of corporations and studios that will jump on stories like that to be like, to, you know, be accessible to what they think people want to hear, but they will just hack them into these sort of whitewashed, simple stories. The ones you've heard, the stories of racism you've heard a million times all over again. Whereas
Hmm.
what this show did is completely fresh, and completely just on a whole different level. That can't. I don't think anything even comes close to it.
Oh,
I think, yeah, I think that your idea, the thought that it's like HBO probably wouldn't have even picked it up. I mean, that for me, you know, in hindsight is the common sense understanding. You know what I mean? Because uh, what they like, it's not on brand for them. And I mean, we're gonna talk a little bit about the Zack Snyder situation because he was originally slated to do this, but kind of pulled out
Oh, thank God.
of doing it. Well, and that's kind
No,
of what it.
he does not have the, he's not armed with, I don't know,
no,
the
I don't think
soul
he would
and the
have been able
mind
to do
of
it.
doing something like this.
Well, like let's get into that now. Like I think that like my general opinion of that is that he doesn't have the storytelling chops for it. I think he's um like his approach to things like 300 and his other movies was visionary from like from uh from a cinematography and effect sense, and like trying to like live up to the visual idea and textures of comic books in a film medium, which I thought was like which I thought was good. It's just like you can't hang your hat on that the entire time, and it's like it got to a point where like I don't know how he could have done something that represents this level of creativity, because which makes me question as to why HBO would have wanted to do it in the first place, especially given how just economic and savvy Lindelof was good in in putting this together. And like he had this big letter that he had written to Watchmen fans about how about the comic books role in his life when he was younger, and that how he really respected the source material. That's why I'd be totally interested in what Alan Moore thought about this. I mean, like he's curmudgeonly, obviously. So
I
I
don't
de-
think he's stable or sane anymore, so I don't know what he
I
would
yeah,
say.
yeah. It's like who knows? It's like the opium has finally caught up with him. That's what he seems like, one of those like Aleister Crowley types who's just like trying to zone out. But like, and also like there's like postmodern ideas with heroism and like and meta and deconstructing it. And I thought that like the issue with the original is that it is like a rehashing minus the ending, frame by frame. It's like when he was asked to submit storyboards, he handed them the comic book.
Of
um
course, yeah.
and and also like I'm not sure if he understands the zeitgeist really, because he's always kind of like existed outside of that, because he's made things that are a little bit more fantastical. But I think that like this is realer than any of the previous material from the Watchmen. Like even the because I mean like we're seeing the squid stuff, but other than that, everything else is And I love the story. About this idea of capturing Manhattan, trying to harness his powers. Like for me, it's something that is reminiscent of like comic book series Days of Future Past, X-Men, and just in terms of like that's really the only kind of comic book predecessor I can really give it, where it's attacking race from this point of the fantastical comic book world. But like I'm a firm believer that if it really hadn't been Lindelof making it, because that's what he did, he made it his own, it probably wouldn't have worked out.
I'm totally agree with that. I don't think it would have worked out. I think it would have still looked amazing. I feel people would have liked it. I think there would have been a lot of mixed reviews, but to really capture just the issues and not even and to bring it into the modern day, like in set in 2019. So to kind of capture these issues where it's like, okay, like certain things, certain laws have been passed already. Um, Even issues with the police. Like that was one of the things that I really kind of enjoyed. It was the whole um, aspect of covering the face to protect the identities of these people who are choosing to take on jobs to go save lives. Um, that is something that as soon as I seen it, I was like, all right, um, wonder how that would look today if we did something like that. So
Hmm.
watching it with that lens and knowing that these conversations are being had, like to fund the police, you know what I mean, and seeing how families were affected by certain things, it just put a whole new perspective. Like Boyan said, this is probably one of the realest things I've seen, and calling it just a typical comic book movie doesn't do it any justice because if Snyder did it, it would have been just that. It would have been another comic book movie. It would have been a little bit grittier. Sure, these themes might have been there, but I don't think he would have done it so stylistically. I don't think he would have done it with the amount of realism. And I think he would have shied away in the storytelling from hitting on those real issues and actually like letting it breathe and letting it happen and not and taking those risks because I feel like a lot of people, especially in this climate, don't want to get quote unquote canceled. You know what I mean? Like cancel culture is heavy, and I feel like he would have been a person that he wouldn't want to take those risks.
No, no, he's built a career on, you know, soft blockbuster stuff. He's not. I don't think he would have had the, I don't know, the emotional intelligence, the creative intelligence, or even or just the bravery of exploring something like that. And I don't think even if he had, I don't think I just don't think he could have handled that kind of story.
No, I
And
don't see this.
yeah,
What do you guys think? I really enjoyed, and I know it feels like we're just shitting on Zack Snyder. I feel like his talent as a filmmaker from like the properties and technical abilities of filmmaking, he's good. I think he absolutely positively needs to be one is always like paired with better writers, that kind of thing. And I think the thing is, this had a very auteur feeling to it. And I think that would be the big difference between Lindelof stylistically and him is that this feels like a very personal thing that was driven by a creative vision, rather than this. I mean, like there is a ever since 300, there's been like a Michael Bayifying of Zack Snyder's work, where it's like, yeah, Michael Bay, he can make movies. We know that. We're not worried about that. It's just like I'm not going to see a movie. I want to see something that's storytelling and that gives you a better understanding of the world and like that all great art. And I mean, at the end of the day, this is objectively good. I find with comic book movies, you're kind of like, that was a good comic book movie. I mean, there's a few that stand out. I mean, like I thought Black Panther was a really big artistic statement, with great performances, especially reevaluating the role of people of color in comic books and in those worlds, and I thought that was really great. But um, I think that this is objectively really good, and I think its reception has reflected that. What are your thoughts on the Manhattan story and how they deal with this? I mean, I thought that they did this in a really clever way, and this was kind of one of the cool things, where I like when the whole reveal with it, where Regina King has to hit him in the head, and that whole thing and the passing of the egg through an organic, sorry, the passing of the powers through the egg and such. I just thought it was so good. Like, what do you guys think of it?
Um, to be honest, it was. I liked how they played on the idea, because she took that drug nostalgia. That's what it's called, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Mhm.
When she took that drug, you know how they kept saying that it could lead to, hallucinations and all these mental problems and breakdowns. So it's kind of like that moment when she's in the kitchen and you see her brandish the hammer. Is she really having a psychosis break and she's about to kill her loving husband? Or is what she's saying true? Because you kind of have no really hints to it unless you're really, really paying attention. There's a couple times I had to like go back and just look at stuff and see if anything was foreshadowed. Because at that scene, I honestly thought she didn't know, and the pills were taking effect of her, right? So for me, it was just one of those like on the edge of your seats type things. So when the reveal was there and it was true, I was kind of like, I kind of had one of those, oh, thank God moments. You know what I mean? So it's pretty interesting to finally have a moment like that when watching film, because as creatives and guys who've studied film, sometimes it's kind of hard to turn off that lens of looking at a film from just a consumer standpoint. And I feel like at that moment, I was just a full on, just a consumer. I wasn't really watching certain things. I was just kind of enamored. I'm like, oh, wow, she's actually going to kill her husband. Like, these drugs really fucked her up. But, it turned out to be. So I thought that was great. And as for the egg, I saw that scene when they're sitting in the bar and she tells him to create life and they create the egg, and playing with that whole paradox of what came first, the chicken and the egg concept. So to see that still play throughout the last couple of episodes, and for them to even end on it, I thought was like just perfect. I don't know any other way how they could have ended that.
Yeah, the whole thing with the egg and their relationship and that drug and everything, all the mind fuckery. I mean, I love that stuff so much, and I find that I love it because it can still basically, as I get older, as I watch more and more and more media and movies and stories, and especially as a filmmaker and everything else, I find that I'm almost able to predict every single movie I've ever seen, from the first scenes almost. Sometimes takes more, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm rarely surprised. I mean, I still find ways to enjoy these films that don't surprise me for character development reasons or whatnot. But in terms of the actual plot and why things are happening, very little surprises me anymore. So I gravitate towards stories that have mindfuck, like where you as a viewer are in a constant state of, is this actually happening, or is this in the character's head, or is this a hallucination, or what's true, what isn't. I mean, this goes back, I think, if anything, this show reminded me, at least in that scene and in that aspect, of Legion, which is another superhero series that doesn't it does not you can't really include in the overall superhero genre because it's thematically so different what it does. But that whole fuckery aspect, where you never know what's real and what isn't, and you can't predict what's going to happen. Like this whole show, like there was very little I could every time I thought I knew what was going to happen, something else happened. And that, to me, I guess, in the end, that's the kind of filmmaking, that's the kind of storytelling that will always have my eyes and my money and whatnot. So I think they handled the whole time aspect with Manhattan and their relationship and his powers and all. They just handle that beautifully. So I mean, and that's not an easy thing to handle at all. That's always you're always opening up as a filmmaker. You always open yourself up to plot holes and problems, and that it's like, oh well, of course it happened because you want it to happen, but you kind of have to like justify everything that happens, and it has to be foolproof to get to that point where you actually really created a great story that uses uh, time travel and alternate dimensions and all that stuff effectively. And this did that really well.
You mentioned Legion, and that's another kind of off the beaten track of the quote unquote comic book genre. What do you think are the similarities between this and approach, that kind of separate these from everything else?
I mean, they're kind of, they're in that sort of list of superhero stuff, but they really do not fall into any of the usual tropes of superhero movies and series and content. They really explore things outside of that, and the way, and because of how much they leave those tropes behind, and they do something completely different. You get far more interesting characters,
Mm-hmm.
whether they're more realistic and based sort of in a real world, or cynical sort of real world, or into something even more fantastical like Legion. Uh, you get far more interesting characters and stories, because they explore deeper aspects of human nature. And I don't think anything else comic wise really gets close to it. It's just, I mean, even something as dark and gritty as Batman, just, there's so many problems with Batman when you. I mean, I love Batman, but there's so many problems when you're trying to like make that, okay. What is the depth of his humanity in this, or like how can we, what do we actually know about Bruce Wayne other than his parents? Anyway, so this sort of basic storytelling is one thing, and then you have advanced storytelling, in terms of exploring human nature when you look at shows like Watchmen and Legion.
Yeah, and I couldn't have said it better myself. I feel like by stripping away a lot of the classic comic book tropes and things that you would and themes that you would normally see, even with characters like Batman, and really letting, like, for a lack of a simple way of saying it, letting humans be humans, right? And what we would do in our, I guess that whole idea of self righteousness and what we would do with ultimate power. We always have these ideas that people would protect. Because one thing I noticed that they talked about in the movie was Dr. Manhattan could have done more. You know what I mean? Like, he has all these powers and he could have done more. And it's this idea that we would believe that a being with all these powers would just come and fix all of our wrongs. And seeing that idea not really play out on screen was really refreshing for me. It was kind of like there's this all powerful being that in one snap could end all of this, but it allowed us to see humans still have to figure out things for themselves. Because let's face it, like in the reality of in the real world, we have to figure out these things itself. So adding that element to something that is supposed to be a fantasy and for all intents and purposes is a fantasy, it's still like it still felt good to see. It felt good to see that none of these characters were the perfect being, and even the people who saved the day still had to pay for their for their actions. Still had to pay consequences. For example, the world's smartest man. At the end of the day, despite him, saving the world yet again, he still had to pay for his crimes against humanity. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I just really love those takes, and I really like the realism of how they put a spin on it.
I think what you're touching at is the core idea here is that when we look at regular comic book superheroes and characters, there's this idea, false idea of like a person or being with immense and ultimate power can
Mm-hmm.
still somehow be just really good, and can just be also, as powerful as they are, they can also be just as good.
Just as
And
good,
then
yeah,
they separate the villains into this comically, like, well, comically, ironically, evil for the sake of evil group,
yeah,
uh, then there's nothing good about them. And whereas shows like this, it's like, okay, the reality is, even, well, the reality, I don't know exactly. We've never had a real Dr. Manhattan, but if we did, having that kind of ultimate power doesn't necessarily that he has ultimate good,
yeah,
or ultimate knowledge. Like, he has knowledge of time in a way that humans can't perceive time. But he still, the context of human life and existence is separated from that, so he doesn't understand what is good and what isn't, or if those concepts can even exist in his way. So basically,
yeah,
having ultimate power doesn't make you ultimately good, is the reality of things. And in fact, it can be the very opposite. The more power you have, the worse you are, and the more separate you are from humanity. And I think that's the big separation between shows like this and most regular comic book content,
Yeah,
superhero content.
I think also, you know, you can make a thing like Batman as dark as you want, but like it'll be there's still like we want to see the Batmobile and what does the Bat costume look like, and there's like these superficial things that get attached to it. And I think like the ones that really like this and Legion is that it's ideas and themes first, and then all the comic book shit afterwards. It's like that's all just kind
Yeah.
of the canvas you're working on, and everything else is, and that's why like even when you see like Batmans that are taken to a little bit more of artistic level that Chris Nolan did, which is obviously fantastic. Bringing adding the darkness that really kind of lives up to the source material. You still can't escape that, and that's where you start
Yeah.
getting trapped by genre because you can't
Mm-hmm.
escape the tropes. So that's why it's like with Legion, it becomes this musing on like really mental health, to be honest with
Hmm.
you. Like it's completely relevant to today, another situation that is completely relevant today, as with racism. And I think that's how they're able to kind of you know get away from it. And I just, it's one of those things where, and I think as comic book fans, and Omar, you're pretty obsessive, it all, like when these things work out on the TV front, like the comic book, like the fate of comic books has been inextricably linked to what happens in movies now, because it's like
Yeah.
there's like a book to movie pipeline for all of these things now, where it's like, let's find the story. Like I was really surprised they made Umbrella Academy into something, because that was such kind of like an not obscure, but like it wasn't particularly as popular as some other graphic novels. And I think that I think that well, not I think that, I hope that it has like ramifications on the idea, because like with all the Avengers movies and stuff coming out and all the Marvel stuff, it's like killing comic book movies as a genre, but it's also killing comic books as a genre. You know what I mean? Like comic books as a medium as well, where it's like, oh, there's that fucking comic book that's just going to become a movie, and I'll wait for this and I'll wait for that. And just like the whole idea of it, I mean, like, do you think something like this breathes new life into the genre, or is this like an anomaly? Do we think that like these are going to be few and far between? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Um, to be honest, I think that if people are paying attention, not just the big studios or the streaming services, but even just the creatives, if they're paying attention, then this could really change how we look at the genre, and not just with the typical comic book to movies, but even creating film, um, creating original superheroes and ideas like this, or just trying something new, not relying on a source material, and actually moving, like creating your own ideas for film. Because let's face it, with the grabbing of content that's going on now with all these streaming services, everybody's looking for new ideas. Everybody wants that one thing that's going to hit. But as for with comic books going to the big screen, or to streaming services, I should say, um, to be honest, I kind of have this fear that eventually comic book writers will start making comics so they can become films, if that makes sense. And I kind of don't want that to happen, because, like you said, like then is what's the point of me even picking up a comic and going to read it if these writers are only going to be catering and writing these pieces just to be made into film? It'll start to take away from the actual authenticity of comic book writing. Because for me, I'll still go pick up a comic. I still want to have that physical comic in my hand, whether it's a manga, whether it's an actual comic book, or a graphic novel. I still want to have that. And I don't want to get caught up in the whole, oh, it's going to be on film in like 6 months, so it doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you'll start getting these like John Grisham for comic books.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like where, I mean, to an extent, I mean, like obviously you have, someone like Stan Lee is like a Stephen King equivalent in terms of like the medium,
Oh, for sure.
right? But you can always tell the Stephen King movies that where he's kind of intending it to, and then you have like epics like The Stand and The Dark Tower, where it's like, how could anybody fucking process that, anyways? So I mean, I always worry. I think that's interesting, because I always worry about that too, where it's like you don't want to see something get so watered down that it's like it takes the joy out of it anymore. You know what I mean? That's what happens when you pull. That's one of the things. I mean, when you're interested in a culture, or in consuming a medium like that, it's exciting when these things come out, but that can be taken away as it gets pulled more into mainstream culture. So it's like you want it to become bigger and more money to go in, and bigger stories and all this awesome stuff, but then all of a sudden what's special about it gets taken away too. Almost like when you discover a new musician or rapper or band, and then all of a sudden everyone else jumps on it and you're like, it's not quite as special as it was before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Just to slightly return to the your question of is this something, is this, are these just one-offs, or is there a new ground being, and I think there new ground being opened up here in terms of comic book content. And I believe, so basically I believe that there is a uncanny valley sort of effect, an invisible line when it comes to comic book stories. And I think what we're seeing with Watchmen and Legion is an actual successful crossing the other side of that uncanny valley, where, and by what I mean by uncanny valley is that original comic book stories, the closer you push them into a gritty, realistic sort of world, the more their flaws some come up and are visible in terms of like they just don't fit into that kind of world. Like, and Batman is a perfect example. Like, I think Nolan just straddled that line of just under uncanny valley, where we still got to see a superhero with gadgets, kick butt, fight evil guys, have a jet car and all that stuff, while still being sort of gritty and realistic. But if you push Batman any further, well, suddenly the questions of like, well, if he's a billionaire, wouldn't he just be way more successful at reducing crime by investing
It
in the
inhibits
community?
your ability to
And
suspend
yeah,
reality.
like,
Yeah,
Yeah,
why not
100%.
just make community services better, and education, and infrastructure, and all this stuff that is the underlying reason for why poverty and crime and all these underlying societal problems exist. That's a much better use of your time and money, Batman. So when you get to that
Yeah.
point, that's when you get to that point, that Batman falls apart. Whereas, these stories have managed to cross over that to be like so real and so cynical in the way they present characters in the world, that they're able to they're able to, it's fertile ground where it's untouched ground almost. There's very few stories that can do that. But I do, with what you were saying, Omar, and I hope it doesn't turn into making comic book style movies or series without ever being attached to a comic. But I think comics are a rich ground, and I hope they always remain a rich ground because they're so much more accessible. You and I can write, if we find a good writer, a good artist, we can write a story that's good. That could
hmm
be a good comic. That could be something interesting, and that's just writing and some drawing and some like making it and printing it out. Whereas somebody getting to the level where they're writing a screenplay for a major film, for a comic, for something that big budget. I mean, most comic book films will always be big budget, just because of what's required of them. That's inaccessible, and right away you're reducing the group of people that are able to get to that level and have access to be able to write screenplays for films.
yeah,
Whereas anybody, and anybody can write a really good comic book story if they have good ideas and they can write it down. And it takes a lot. Obviously it's not super easy.
hmm
Obviously, I'm not making. I mean, the people that do this stuff put in blood, sweat, and tears into making it. I know a lot of independent comic book writers and creators. So not to insult them here, but I'm saying it's a lot more accessible, and the range of stories that can be written and maybe eventually adapted if somebody has an eye for these more obscure, smaller scale independent stories that can be written by all sorts of people around the world. I think, I hope that that's where this whole comic book film thing evolves into, rather than just die off, because it's just the raw resources for incredible stories by writers that you don't often see in Hollywood is much richer, if that remains a source.
And it makes sense because HBO provided like a place for this, you know what I mean, and FX too. And if you look at like the stuff those channels are really pushing, I mean, FX has shows like Atlanta, and where it's really where it's not conventional, you know what I mean? You're thinking about Atlanta is going to be some musing on the hip hop industry, and from the way it was presented at the very beginning, and it's not that at all. And there's really the addition of philosophical and literary technique in this, playing with surrealism, playing with postmodernism, and looking at these and like writing. That's the thing. I mean, some of these other movies, I mean, they're not like, listen, there's classic things that have comic book elements throughout literature. I mean, like, you have things like Beowulf and such, and they've always existed, and they'll always be turned into things. And this fantastical elements, are always going to be in story. You know what I mean? Because fuck, it's built into the religion, and like, I mean, all of these are just extensive, just extensions of one another. And I think that it's interesting that HBO provided this, and again, it makes sense because everything else has become stale. So I think maybe it was one of those things where these channels are like, listen, if we're gonna do the superhero thing, then it's got to be something fresh. That's because I mean, you can do all these varied stories, but still, you have to remain on brand. I mean, like, there's through lines to every HBO thing, where they really tackle the angst of just being alive in general, and the best stuff does that. Whereas, I feel like, again, the genre getting stale. What I want to do to finish this up, I really want to talk about Regina King and Jeremy Irons, who were both nominated for their performances. What were our thoughts on these performances?
I was blown away. I didn't know where things were gonna go, and just the range that these two had, and the types of characters they were playing, were I don't know, it like you and I discussed even through text message the other day, like like you said, Regina King found her role. Like, this role showcased her range, showcased what she's capable of, showcased every just kind of every aspect of the type of character she could play. And I kind of hope that we do get a second scene, because I would love to see more of her, because I have never seen her in this light, and I think it's just perfect. Jeremy Irons was just phenomenal. Just even that whole scene when they're in the house and having that family dinner, and him singing and stuff like that, and then just to feel the connection and the love and the partnership that he had with her, only to find out the flip that he was somebody else. He had other intentions. You know what I mean? It kind of was just like, I fell in love with that character, and then I was conflicted, and the show made me be conflicted. But at the same time, I kind of still didn't completely hate him. And I don't know, like, I just feel like they really grasped how people would be in that climate, in the world that they created.
Um, Honestly, I don't have a lot to say. I mean, I love their both performances,
Hmm.
and pretty much I have to double up pretty much everything Omar said. I think these roles were they were really well cast for their roles, and you can always tell when an actor is just placed in a role that was just meant for them, and they owned it. I mean, they're both great actors that have always done really well, and I just there's I'm not I'm it's almost I almost don't have anything to say because I'm not surprised at all.
Hmm.
It's not like it's an Adam Sandler who suddenly does what was that movie, the serious movie that he did?
Uncut
He did
Gems,
really well.
Uncut Gems.
No, well sorry, I guess two now. Uncut Gems,
Punch Drunk Love.
Punch Drunk Love. Yeah, it's not like an actor like that suddenly gets a role that's perfect for him and suddenly he shines in a dramatic way. No, they're incredible actors, and they got incredible roles and they did really well. So I can't really go into more detail than that because it's just a pleasure to watch always when they're on
Oh,
screen.
I feel
definitely.
I feel like I grew up watching Regina King because I mean, she's in Friday. She plays
Hmm.
Ice Cube's sister, so she's great in that. I mean, she was in Poetic Justice. She was in Higher Learning. So these are like my early, like, sitting with my aunt who's like only 8 years older than I am. So she's like an older sister, watching these movies. And I think her performance in If Beale Street Could Talk was fantastic. Obviously got the Oscar for it, but that was in I believe the supporting role. I think this is really her and like the bona fide absolute proof that she can carry something from beginning to end. Like her performance was fantastic, heartbreaking at times, really embracing the subject matter, and really, continuing this idea of seeing her. And I'm glad that like Beale Street Guitar got, her performance got the Oscar. And I love that she was in this. When I saw the casting, I'm like, interesting casting, she's talented, how's that going to work? She worked right from the time she steps on the screen to the time she gets off. She's fantastic. The Jeremy Irons, I mean, I always like actors who are kind of let off their leash, so to speak, where they can, put all of themselves into performance, where they can, feel free to be over the top, and really kind of use all those chops that they have. And I feel when I watch the Jeremy Irons performance of Ozymandias that he's enjoying this. He's really kind of like, I know it's not as, higher art as this is, but like in a movie like Die Hard with a Vengeance, he's like that. He's over the top. He's just unfettered, and he just is going for it. And it's one of those things where it becomes a pleasure to watch. I think this is another one where he's, fantastic. And I mean, he's always good. I mean, like, for example, growing up, I love the movie The Man in the Iron Mask. Doesn't hold up in time now, but his performance has always stayed with me. But then in things like, even in like smaller parts in Kingdom of Heaven, he was in Kafka, the Soderbergh thing, a Reversal of Fortune, which he won the Oscar for, which he was fantastic in. But this is one of my favorite Jeremy Irons roles. Like, that's what I kind of like about this, is that there is the elements to maintain levels of darkness and realism, but then these performances are just over the top and unmoored, and I really kind of appreciate it. And I want to touch on something you guys said before we go. You were touching on the idea of the second season. So there was this whole thing where there was talk that Lindelof was going to do a second season, and then they kind of just canned it. Because he was just like, I don't really see the point in revisiting it. Like, do you think a second season would tarnish this, or would you want it?
I mean, if Lindelof
Yeah.
is speaking out of just creative honesty, that he doesn't want to do a second season because he doesn't think there needs to be a second season, and I think from the interview that I read on that topic, he said, every time somebody had an idea, or they had an idea about, hey, here's what we can do in second season, they just found a way to integrate that into the show. And I'm I have a lot of respect for creators that can say, here's what I wrote 3 seasons, or I wrote 2 seasons, or I wrote a season, or this is just a mini series, and this is what I want it to be, and here's my idea, here's everything I had to say about this. And then just do that and walk away is immense artistic sort of integrity and respect for people that can do that. Not that I don't like people who carry on something that I really loved, even though it wasn't originally written for a season, for more than one season or anything like that. But it takes a lot of balls to do that, and I think if he feels that he told the story that he wanted to tell, and that adding another season would just be stretching it, or doing, or even maybe taking away from first season, then I think it's good as it is, and they should just keep it that way. And I'm glad it's one season. I mean, obviously I want to see more from the world, and honestly, if they gave it to if they gave the world to another filmmaker who had another original idea in that world that was loosely tied to this one, I mean, that could be an incredible, see, that could be an incredible new way of doing like a like a Marvel universe, but for Watchmen. It's just give it to, instead of trying to like work up to some goals 20 films from now, just give filmmakers this world, and give them some space to do an original idea that doesn't have to be too connected to the one previous to them. I could see that as a second season and a third and a fourth, but I think if he's told his story and he's satisfied, then this is perfect as is.
Almost like making the Watchmen like an tour vehicle, to kind of go through, where it
Yeah.
becomes these like personal ideas. I want to interject just for a second, Omar, because I know you're itching to get in on it. So they originally, so it's been nominated as a limited series, but originally it was classified. They had not intended, I guess, but had classified it as just regular series. And then as it moved on and it became clear that they weren't going to do any more, that Lindelof wasn't going to do any more, they decided to make it a limited series, which it's been nominated for, one of the best limited series. Go, Omar.
Okay, well, to be honest, like I agree with Boyan. As much as I would love a second season, like just because, again, this was my first watch, and I feel like I don't know. As much as I was satisfied, I just want more of that world. So that's kind of why I would want a second season. But I do respect the integrity of a creator saying, you know what, I did tell my story, and if I go back to it, I'm probably going to tarnish it or, take away from what we all love about it. You know what I mean? But to create a world and allow maybe another creator, another director to take on that world and maybe tell a different story within that world would be something interesting to see, just because we know the reputation of HBO, and I think they would still do a great job. And I think the world that was created it is amazing, and because of its realism, and because we do live in the real world, I feel there's other issues that can be tackled and would be interesting to see in a world like that. So that's why I would like a second season, but I am satisfied. Like, I would just rewatch this again and enjoy it just as much as I've enjoyed it now.
And imagine, I think this is definitely one of those properties that if you watch it again and again and again, you'll discover something new. There's just so much stuff that's happening that it's impossible to take it in one sitting. So I'm excited for my next watch.
Oh, for sure. I definitely can't wait to watch it again.
On that note, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and we got to get going.
Yes, sir.
All right, guys, thanks so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, rate and subscribe to our channel wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to follow the Mind Refinery on social media. Until next time.